Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Friday Symposium. Today is February 21st, and we are certainly in an amazing moment of transition. It's, in fact, the whole world, particularly the transatlantic so-called Western civilized nations, are completely in a turmoil between the speech given by Vice President J.D. Vance at Munich, President Trump's comments about Zelensky being a dictator, accusing Zelensky of being foolish to start the war, which I suppose you could argue as long as you understand that it was the British and the US really who started the Ukraine-Russia conflict. The kind of roller coaster ride over this ceasefire in the Middle East? Are we going to end up with a peace plan along the lines of Lyndon LaRouche's Oasis plan, which ensures a sovereign Palestinian state and an Israeli state side by side with adequate water and reconstruction? Is something else in mind? We did get Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, Robert Kennedy Jr. all confirmed now, so you have some real enemies of the so-called intelligence community or the rogue elements of the intelligence community now in place, and policies are being moved, changes are being made very, very rapidly. Now, back in October, uh, Jose Vega and I had an event dedicated to peace, where we invited many leaders of the retired intelligence and military figures like Scott Ritter, Ray McGovern, Colonel Wilkerson, and others, plus Jimmy Dore, do dissidents, and that was interspersed with classical music. And then the following day, Scott Ritter and the Eisenhower Media Group hosted a 3-panel discussion that included some other people, commentators, podcasters who have a substantial following, like Danny Haifong, Judge Napolitano. Myself and Jose also participated in that. And one of the questions, in response to one of the questions, which I can't remember but about the question of peace and how to have good relations and what could the US and Russia work on together, I happened to comment that perhaps the best thing for world peace would be if a large asteroid were making its way toward planet Earth, but it was a few years away. I think I said 4 years, and it would force mankind to come together to figure out how to address it, because asteroids do not have to be all that terribly large to wipe out most of the planet, as likely occurred about 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs and 99% or so of all species were wiped out by the climate change, which did occur as a result of a massive space related galactic impact. So now it turns out that there is an asteroid, they say not big enough to destroy the whole planet, but a city killer potentially, which has about a 3% or so likelihood, they say, of making impact with the Earth. If it hits a major city and region, they're saying it could take out as many as 100 million people. That would be quite catastrophic. And I think that we should begin discussing this. It seems that in the discussion that President Trump had with President Putin, one of the areas that they did talk about collaborating is in space. So I've invited Jason Ross of LaRouche's science team, fellow LaRouche organization board member, to join me in a discussion about the development of LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, which is something called the Strategic Defense of Earth, which may involve some of the same technology and certainly will encourage some scientific breakthroughs and collaborations. So Jason, I'm really glad you're here, and please go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity, Diane. I appreciate it. So Diane had mentioned this asteroid that has recently been calculated to potentially be on a collision course with Earth. This is the asteroid named YR4 2024, and here you can see the offending rock in our environment. This has a potential of striking the Earth in 2032. And depending on where it impacts, if it strikes the Earth, it would have the ability to destroy an entire major metro area if it landed on one. Based on its size, it would impart an energy of about 50 megatons, which is 1,000 times the energy of the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It would be roughly equivalent to if one of the Ohio-class nuclear submarines launched all of its missiles. That's the amount of destructive potential that this thing could have. Now, our current equipment is going to lose sight of this asteroid sometime in April, and we won't be able to see it again until 2028. That'll be the next chance to be able to update our projections. So, confronted with that, I think that there's some questions that we ought to be asking. We should ask ourselves, first off, what do we know about the threats of these asteroids? How do we discover them? Second, what do we do about it? That's pretty important. 3, about the kind of international cooperation that's required. And this goes back to the Strategic Defense Initiative and Strategic Defense of Earth that Diane mentioned. And then 4th, what will be the benefits to society more generally of our choosing to take up this mission? So, first, how do we know what asteroids are out there? How do we find them? In the 1990s, the US Congress mandated that NASA work to be able to discover and chart the orbits of at least 90% of near-Earth objects more than 1 kilometer in diameter. The impact of objects that large would be global. It might not kill everyone on Earth if it's only 1 kilometer, but it'll certainly have implications worldwide and completely destroy a country or region that it strikes. The task of finding those 90% of such enormous world-ending asteroids is considered to be complete. The scientists think that they have 93% of those charted at this point. And let's talk about how that occurred. So I want to talk a bit about this space telescope, which was one of the major players in finding these things. This is the Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer, or WISE. It launched at the end of 2009. So it's a space telescope. It sees in the infrared range. It is 40 centimeters in diameter, and it had 4 infrared wavelength bands that it focused on, from 3.4 microns to 22 microns. In comparison, our vision is at around half a micron. So this is light that we can't see in the infrared. Now, why use infrared light to look for asteroids? Why not just use a normal telescope like the ones that we see when we look through a magnifying lens with our eyes? Well, the reason is that many asteroids are dark. They might not be lit at a good angle by the sun, and they might simply be very dark. If you were looking for a piece of charcoal, floating around out in space, and there are carbonaceous asteroids, how are you going to see it? So the answer is that not only do objects reflect light, that's how we see things with our eyes, but objects also emit light. That's how incandescent light bulbs work. They get very hot and they start to emit light. Now, any object that isn't at absolute zero does emit some light in the infrared range. So the purpose of using this kind of satellite is to be able to see the heat coming off of these asteroids, even if they don't reflect very much light, even if they're very dark. So the project worked with all of its capabilities for 1 year, and then it ran out of the coolant required to keep the telescope cold enough that it would see the asteroids rather than itself. And then it functioned for another 10 years using its other the other wavelengths. So over the course of that first year, WISE looked at the entire sky in all directions. And then over the 10 years that it functioned after that, it closed down permanently last year. It made more than 20 passes of the entire sky. And this is one example. There's also ground-based observations. There are other space-based platforms. The result of all of this is that we have found about 30,000 or so objects, speaking roughly here, and 3,000 are discovered every year. The best estimates are that we've found at least 90% of the really big ones. We found about half of those that are greater than 140 meters in diameter, and we've not even found 1% of those below 140 meters. The asteroid that's been in the news recently, this YR4 2024, is an example of that last category. It's small, it's about 40 or so meters in diameter, and it's only recently been discovered to have an orbit that could potentially threaten us. Here's a chart that was developed by the NASA WISE program showing the different sizes of asteroids, and then you see with the colors there, the yellowy brown, those are the ones that we found. The rest are the ones still out there, they believe. So there's a lot of work to be done. Now, the work requires more advanced space telescopes, especially infrared ones. It means that we need to put them in locations that make it possible to see asteroids very well. So for example, if instead of being in orbit around the Earth, we have a space-based satellite that orbits around the sun, but closer to the sun than us, say if it's in the orbit of Venus, then it's going to be able to look out from the sun to see, because if something's near the sun, you can't see it. The sun's too bright. So if you're closer to the sun at Venus, you'll get a better view of objects that are really near the Earth than you would get if you were just in Earth orbit. So how to do that? Well, in 2005, NASA mandated that NASA find all such objects. This is from the bill. Quote, "The Congress declares that the general welfare and security of the United States require that the unique competence of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in science and engineering systems be directed to detecting, tracking, cataloging, and characterizing near-Earth asteroids and comets in order to provide warning and mitigation of the potential hazard of such near-Earth objects impacting the Earth." It's a worthy goal, but Congress didn't appropriate any money for this mandate, so it hasn't happened. So seeing that there was a lack of government funding, concerned individuals personally worked together to make a nonprofit, the B612 Foundation, to build and launch their own space telescope. They sought private funding, they sought NASA grants. The goal was to find 90% of objects at least 140 meters in size. They called it the Sentinel Space Telescope. But it lost its extremely meager NASA funding in 2015. NASA was paying a lousy $30 million a year to help this thing move forward, and they cut that. And they weren't able to get together the $500 million from private investors to make this thing a reality. So that didn't happen, but on the horizon is a fantastic new platform from NASA itself. It's called the NEO, Near Earth Object, NEO Surveyor. And if the people working on it aren't laid off and it continues on track as it's supposedly going to, it will launch in 2027. It will sit not at the orbit of Venus distance from the sun, but it will sit at a special astronomical point in between the Earth and the sun. So it'll be on the sun side of the Earth, meaning that the Earth will always be in the direction away from the sun for it. A satellite that simply goes around the Earth would have been able to do. They expect that this will find 200,000 to 300,000 new asteroids, and that it will be able to find them as small as 10 meters in diameter. It will be passively cooled, so it won't run out of coolant and shorten the mission like in the previous WISE satellite. Every day, it will send 10 gigabytes of data back to Earth, where people around the world will be able to use that to chart asteroids, discover their orbits, and learn more. So this raises the next question. Finding asteroids is half the battle. The other question is, what do we do? So one of the easiest things, you might say, is, well, if the object is small and the zone of destruction is only local, you can evacuate. If we find out for sure that this asteroid is going to strike some part of the Earth in 2032, well, we better get out of there. That's the best we've got right now. But what if the object is large? Or what if we aren't content to simply abandon, a metro area when an asteroid is coming to take it out? Are we going to evacuate millions of people and everything from it? So how do we prevent one of these objects from colliding with us? This whole question comes down to the amount of energy that we're able to impart to that rocky threat. There's a few ways you could do this. One is you could just run into it. You can launch a rocket and smash into the asteroid. That'll give it a little push that'll change its orbit. If you do this well in advance, let's say it's 10 years in advance, that slight change in the orbit will have so much time to affect its location 10 years from now that you might be able to actually do something about it. There's other technologies that are proposed. One is using a laser. If you zap the asteroid with the laser, you're going to vaporize the material on its surface, and that'll end up acting like a rocket, and that'll push it, and you'll be able to change its orbit that way. Will these lasers be shot from the Earth? Will we have space-based lasers? What will they be powered with? These are good questions. We might attach a rocket to the asteroid. That is, land a rocket on it and then fire up its engine. This might be a solar-powered engine, like an ion thruster. It might be a nuclear rocket, which gets into where we really need to go on all of this. Overall, if we've got a large asteroid, or let's say a comet, which we get very little warning of, heading towards us, we're going to need a lot of power. And only nuclear power is going to be able to achieve that. That means that we are going to have to work on nuclear fusion, on developing nuclear rockets to be able to get out there and quickly reach an object that's threatening us. Many of these incredible NASA missions that go to the moons of Saturn or wherever, they take years and years and years and years to get there because they have so little fuel. If you've got a nuclear rocket, you can run the engine all the time because you're not going to run out of gas. You can get going faster and faster and faster and faster, and you can very rapidly make your way out to a threat. And then you can blow it up with a nuclear weapon, help push it away. So some of this stuff we're capable of doing now, some of it we are not. I do want to show a tremendously exciting video of what NASA was able to achieve in 2022. Here it is.
What would an asteroid that is a kilometer in diameter, what would it do if it hit the Earth?
Good question. And the next video will show us what the answer is, or what we could do to make sure that it doesn't happen. We're going to see about a mission that NASA launched. Well, the rocket launched in 2021, but what occurred was in 2022, and this was the DART mission. Okay, ready? Let's go for it.
4, 3, 2, 1. And liftoff of the Falcon 9 and DART on NASA's first planetary defense test to intentionally crash into an asteroid.
Even if we do everything right, our sensors work well, our spacecraft is doing well, even then, we might still miss.
4, 3, 2, first time ever humanity has changed the orbit of a planetary object.
NASA confirms that DART successfully changed the targeted asteroid's trajectory.
Using the ground-based telescopes around the world to watch the system and see how it's affected by this impact event.
This is a watershed moment for planetary defense and a watershed moment for humanity.
This is pretty phenomenal. We were able to strike a tiny object millions of miles away while traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, and it was basically a perfect bullseye. The goal was to see what the impact is of a kinetic impactor, which is the lowest of those forms of technology that I had mentioned before, capable of changing the orbit of an object. In this case, there were two asteroids, a bigger one, relatively speaking, and a very small one orbiting around it like a little moon. The NASA team impacted the smaller one, the revolving moon, and were able to measure the impact that it had on its orbit. This little moonlet went around about once every 12 hours, and they were hoping to shift it by 1 minute, to change the time of its period by a minute. The actual result was over half an hour of time change in its orbit. So this was better than was expected, and it led to new insights into what the physical processes were on this kind of interaction. Now, that is not going to be enough to take care of a major threat, but it shows, I think, in a very inspiring way, the kinds of projects that we should be working on here in the United States and with international cooperation. So that brings us to the third point. How do we work on this as a human species? How do we work on this planet-wide? So some of these technologies I'd mentioned, if you've got lasers and nuclear rockets and nuclear explosives in space, you're just going to need a new international agreement to do that. That's going to violate the current outer space treaties, which forbid there being any weapons in space. We're also going to need to cooperate with countries and locations around the world. We need satellites, that too. We need telescopes all around the world so that we can always see things. We need to collaborate on making improved satellites, and we need to work together on means of deflecting a threat before it takes us out. So for this, the reference that Diane had brought up and which LaRouche used was Ronald Reagan's 1983 proposal for a strategic defense initiative. Reagan said that the threat of nuclear weapons required not only efforts to reduce the number of these warheads through agreements between the US and the Soviet Union, but the development of fundamentally new technologies to make those weapons ineffective. Reagan called for not the kind of anti-missile systems that we have today, but he said we need new physical principles. We need new technologies. His thinking in this concept, which came directly from Lyndon LaRouche, who was pushing for this in his own presidential campaign, would be to develop lasers, particle weapons, particle beams, this kind of thing, to be able from space to take out a nuclear warhead wherever it was launched from. And Reagan said to the Soviet Union, let's do this together. We both have a lot of knowledge, we both have a lot of experience, and we can both benefit. So I think that brings us to the one of the final points here, which is how are nations going to work together on this? The question today is, will the United States, China, Russia, India, ESA, JAXA, other space agencies, will we work together to take on the threat common to us all, or will we allow other squabbles to detract us from that mission? And then the last question, and this is directly relevant to the space program of the moon program, the Apollo mission launched by Kennedy, is what are the benefits of investing and creating these scientific breakthroughs? So there's a lot of thought right now about budget cutting, and it's important to know that some things have negative costs. Going to the moon, that was expensive. It had an enormous cost. It was a lot of money. It was a lot of effort. A lot of resources went into that. But the profits were far more than the cost. How so? Did NASA make money by going to the moon? No, not directly. But think about all of the technological breakthroughs, the manufacturing breakthroughs, the process breakthroughs that were required to produce the Apollo program and all of its necessary components. What this meant was a real renaissance in American manufacturing, huge breakthroughs in precision, huge breakthroughs in electronics and so forth. And what this meant was that the entire economy benefited. Not just once, like the one-time cost of the project, but forever. We continue to benefit from the technological breakthroughs achieved through Kennedy's bold mission of going to the moon. Today, the question facing us, the stakes are even higher. A strategic defense of Earth, an international cooperation to develop the detection technologies, the interception technologies, the nuclear power in space to be able to move these threats away from us. This is a guiding concern for the international community. And the question is, are we going to allow ourselves to walk into a potential catastrophe? If it's not this asteroid, it's going to be one someday. Or will we take on the mission of averting that calamity for our entire planet?
Thanks very much. This actually was kind of scary.
Good.
The-
It is scary.
I mean, the thought of evacuating that number of people, which right now may be the only option if we don't work on these things. And also, I think it is important to clarify, because there's clearly an enormous amount of confusion about what the Strategic Defense Initiative was of Reagan. We saw it with Zakharova's response to Trump's proposal of an Iron Dome, which the media compared to LaRouche and Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, which it is not. And I'm glad that you brought up the point was that the US and the Soviet Union were going to develop this simultaneously, because of course the idea was to end the threat of nuclear war. The idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative was not so that one side would have a first strike capability and the other one wouldn't be able to respond. That was the whole reason of developing it jointly, and also that the technology did not exist and that all of mankind was going to benefit economically from the breakthrough that would be required. So one thing I would appreciate is if you would say something about what might be some of the spin-offs of actually working on this project. How would that affect eradicating poverty or economic development in poor countries? Why could we say something like that?
I think to give a very specific answer, I'd point to nuclear fusion. If we're going to have really effective space rockets, there has been work on nuclear rockets already. In fact, NASA had a model. They were working on one and actually building one half a century ago. It was called the NERVA. But the breakthrough we really need is nuclear fusion, which is the process that powers the sun, where tiny elements like hydrogen join together and release enormous amounts of power. Now, if we're going to be able to get to an asteroid or a comet, which is much harder, that's coming our way, we need the power to turn the rocket engine on the whole way. You can only do that with nuclear, and the best way to do that is going to be through nuclear fusion. Now, a crash program to develop a nuclear fusion rocket, well, that's going to demand breakthroughs in nuclear fusion domestically. And this is going to mean movement towards having nuclear fusion power. The potential of this to reduce the cost of energy dramatically totally transforms our relationships to materials, to production, and to resources like water. For example, water desalination, it works for cities, but to do it on an agricultural scale, it's pretty expensive right now with current technologies. But if you bring down the price of power by an order of magnitude, speaking very roughly, through using nuclear fusion instead of windmills or natural gas or something like that, you're going to make it possible to desalinate water on a much greater scale. You're going to be able to green deserts all around the world. We're going to be able to transform our relationship to mining, to materials processing with the incredible amounts of heat and power that nuclear fusion would provide for us. So the biggest barriers or the biggest necessities for development around the world are definitely transportation, energy, and then I'd say in today's world also communications. And ground transportation, rail lines, okay, that might not be a very direct spin-off of this, but certainly energy, communications, and that breakthrough that's going to open a new chapter in the book of humanity, nuclear fusion, I think will get an enormous boost from international cooperation on a strategic defense of Earth.
I think that's really important. And I want to put an idea out there that Lyndon LaRouche really worked on when he was opposing the free trade agreement, and you'll see where this is going. He said, look, when you have free trade, if you have American factories moving to Mexico or Bangladesh or some other impoverished nation, what happens is that they are then using slave labor. They're not upholding certain environmental standards. They're not upholding certain educational standards of the population. And somebody gets rich, namely the owner of the factory, but the productive power of the planet as a whole, of mankind as a whole, goes down. So you're creating a process which not only is not sustainable, it's a collapse function. So therefore, it's not only not in the interest of the plant workers who are losing their jobs in the United States to ship to some place that's using slave labor, but it's also degrading the economic process of the planet as a whole. Now, the people I heard speaking today at the CPAC convention were not very clear about this. For example, they were cheering about getting Panama to leave China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is very short-sighted. And also, I think might become a problem. I don't know if this is true, but I heard one commentator say that China operates the ports at either end of the canal. It's their equipment. They are the builders of the largest ports on the planet right now, and they have the cranes and the lifts and the ships and everything else. Are they going to leave their equipment there if they're not allowed to operate this port, for example? That was what someone brought up. I don't know if that's a true threat or not, but if you're cheering the impoverishment of a nation, you are cheering something that's going to come around and kick you in the backside ultimately, because you're lowering the capacity of the planet as a whole. We heard the same thing about North Macedonia, which was hailed as being a very, very important nation because somehow the United States has persuaded them to stay out of the Belt and Road, and that two of the corridors of the Belt and Road would normally pass through that country. So now they're going to have to avoid it, and that somehow this is going to create the possibility for a pipeline for the United States to ship LNG, right? What are we doing? I mean, Russia's much closer. You would think it would be much less expensive than the United States having to ship LNG all over Europe. These kind of things are insane and very short-sighted, and actually have the effect ultimately of lowering the standard of living in the United States, even though people think differently about it. So I think we're going to have to do an education process in the United States for people to understand these principles. But what do you say about that?
Well, let me take an example. I was on a radio program in Cameroon recently, so I've sort of been thinking about Africa this week. Let's take the case of South Africa as an example. You brought up Panama, where the U.S. essentially said, get out of the Belt and Road Initiative or else, and succeeded in getting that agreement from Panama. South Africa is similarly in hot water from the current U.S. administration. The executive order that Trump issued on South Africa, it talked about land expropriation and how the Afrikaners white South Africans are welcome to come to the U.S. as refugees. But look, the main reason for that was South Africa's moral stand for the world at the International Court of Justice against the destruction of Palestinian life that Israel is committing in Gaza and then also increasingly in the West Bank. South Africa stood up on that and has made many enemies among some of the worst people on this planet. So the U.S. is now telling South Africa, you better back off on this political issue. And also a man who has been named as potentially becoming the ambassador from the United States to South Africa. I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but he is himself of Afrikaner descent. He's an American who originally came from South Africa. He's quite open about saying that South Africa must choose U.S. or China. Take your pick. He said, if you want to go with China, best wishes to you, but you're out of the U.S. You're not going to be part of our markets. You're outside of our system. Your call, but you got to choose. That kind of crazy thinking impoverishes the entire world by forcing countries that would be very happy to do trade with the US and with China, which is like every country would like that, into having to make a choice. And it's completely unnecessary. There is nothing stopping, fundamentally, the United States from cooperating with China on significant projects in third countries. Let me mention one to come to Africa again. The Grand Inga Dam system would be a hydropower complex on the Congo River that would be able to produce 40,000 megawatts, 40 gigawatts of power. This is enough at current energy levels in the area. It's enough for over 100 million people. It would completely transform the development potential of the DRC and countries in the entire area around it. This is a project that's not going to happen unless the United States and China cooperate on it. It's just not going to happen any other way, at least not in today's world. So this, to me, would be a guiding example of a project that would benefit the world tremendously, that would have an indirect impact significantly on the migration crisis that we're experiencing, and would be an opportunity to shape a new paradigm of relations with China. But it's going to require a big change in thinking in the United States.
Yeah, it's very challenging. I mean, it really shouldn't be challenging. It should be obvious in a sense. Every astronaut who goes into Earth orbit, looking back on planet Earth, is blown away by how tiny our planet is. Our planet is very tiny with respect to even our own solar system, let alone the Milky Way galaxy, let alone the universe as a whole. So when people see that, they say, why on earth, we're in this little space, would we not be collaborating for the advancement of our species? How on earth can we be trying to claw each other's eyes out over possession of something or other in this little tiny place? And you also, I think people don't have a conception of growth because, of course, if we say we're competing for quote unquote markets, well, if the markets are growing, then there's room for everyone. If people's consumption of energy is increasing exponentially as it should, then there's no problem. We're going to need more energy. Everybody will have to get into the act.
Yeah, I'm picturing, how foolish the thinking is of not taking the world first. I'm picturing a comet is discovered. It's going to knock out, it destroys Washington, D.C. The government has been relocated and evacuated beforehand. And they say, well, but at least the South China Sea isn't controlled by China. or, at least we got the Chinese out of Panama. It is really, it's very crazy. It's really juvenile because it really comes from the empire conception, the oligarchical conception that characterized the British Empire and against which we fought a revolution. So for us to think that another's gain is our loss, especially when that other is not, a militarist threat. I mean, China hasn't invaded anybody. I mean, not in recent history. This is not a major threat. Okay, so the idea of looking at what is my position compared to others, instead of taking an absolute view of where are we going, what is our status, what kind of level of technology, what kind of level of culture have we achieved. That's the goal, not fighting and squabbling with each other.
Exactly. So what do you think? Are we going to be able to stop this asteroid from hitting us? And what
Well,
if we discover one that's closer? There could be asteroids that are closer, right? I mean,
yeah.
that's kind of scary.
I mean, that was one thing that we saw. This asteroid is in the smallest range. I had showed a chart that showed what percent of asteroids we knew of various sizes. And it fit in the smallest category, of which we've discovered less than 1%. But we also haven't discovered most of them that are, in the next larger category, the ones that would be big enough to, let's say, wipe out Germany, destroy one of the US states. We've only found half of those. So yes, we could wake up any day and find out that not 7 years from now, as in the case of this one, which is also, it's not certain that it's even going to strike the Earth. We indeed could wake up tomorrow with the news that there's an asteroid or a comet. The reason I keep bringing up comets, asteroids, they're in our solar system. You can watch them over time and project where they're going to be in 30 years from now. If you have a comet that has a highly elliptical orbit, so instead of just kind of going around the sun, it goes way far away from the sun and then it comes back, like Halley's Comet. Well, if it's way out here, you can't see it. And by the time it's coming this way, it might be on course to hit you. You're not going to have much time. So it's a real threat. And again, the only way that this can succeed, because of the technologies required, even if the US wanted to do this on its own, which we should, we should have that desire to say, we're going to make this happen. It's something that can only occur with new international agreements.
I think we also have a cultural problem, because the first article I saw about this said that the attitude, they gave you the sense that the attitude was, well, it's only a 2.8% chance that it's going to hit the Earth, and it's not that large. It probably, if it hits at all, would just take out a major city. So it's nothing to worry about. I mean, that was sort of the way it was covered. And that's why I wanted to take up this discussion, because that, of course, is insane. Who would say that? Oh, well, we're just going to lose Chicago or Boston or some big city like Beijing. I mean, that's really crazy. But we also see, I mean, look what just happened to Gaza, right? 1.9 million people just made homeless and their land turned into rubble. So perhaps part of that attitude comes from the idea that we are doing this and nobody seems to mind it. Well, actually, probably about 2/3 of the world's population minds it very much. It's just the people over here who think it's not such a big deal because it's not happening to them, maybe. And then the coverage actually changed, and I saw an article saying, well, NASA's doing everything. And they admit in the bottom of the article that they're reaching out to other space agencies. But obviously, this is somewhat of an emergency. I mean, if I'm sitting in the path of an asteroid and everything around me is going to be annihilated, or God forbid, the entire planet, so nothing that you've done in your life or that Beethoven did in his life will matter anymore, then it seems that we really, I think it would be fine to swallow your pride and work with China and Russia and India and the UAE and everybody else who's been working on space exploration.
Well, the dinosaurs didn't have a space program. And like you brought up in the beginning, look what happened to them. All gone, along with most life on Earth. Um, it is possible that there's something that large that could strike us that we don't know about right now. And look, if it's not this asteroid, there will be one. It's going to happen. Will it happen during our lifetimes? I don't know. But is the Earth overall undefended against these space threats? Yes, we're undefended. This DART mission from NASA, and I'll say, watching that video, getting ready for our discussion tonight, I mean, it moved me to tears repeatedly. I watched it a couple of times. Just that cooperation on something so meaningful and important that obviously benefits every single human being on this planet. If you think about what can we do to get international successes, what can we do to drive nations together? What kind of goals could we take up? It's hard to imagine anything more unifying than space.
Exactly. One question, was that mission the same as because I remember that we quote unquote landed on an asteroid. Was that mission or was that something else?
Oh no, that was another one. I think it landed on Apophis was the name of that. It landed, it took a little sample, and it brought it back to the Earth. And that same spacecraft, I think, is now going to take a look at another asteroid. That mission is still alive.
Well, because I believe that asteroid was selected from data gathered from the telescope at Arecibo in Puerto Rico. And here's another crime. This telescope supposedly was destroyed by a storm or something, and it was never rebuilt. And they had a phenomenal program there, educating young people, creating a whole culture of science, and that was not considered a priority. And I think, again, it's one of these things where you have to think of the productive capacity of the planet, of mankind on the planet as a whole. Is your policy increasing the power of mankind to transform nature for the better, or is your policy decreasing that power, meaning that you are also contributing to depopulation? Because when you do that, you lower life expectancy, you lower what LaRouche called potential relative population density. You're actually lowering the ability of the planet to sustain human life when you do things that send us backwards.
Yeah. And you might always say, well, we've got other needs. We shouldn't spend money on this. But I mean, the only fundamental and durable source of economic growth is in developing new scientific breakthroughs. So, South Africa's certainly got its troubles right now, but the work on what will be the largest radio telescope functioning as an array continues. So, I mean, you have to have these long-term goals, and I think that space, the strategic defense of the Earth, and the breakthroughs in nuclear fusion that it would require could do a lot of work towards bringing countries together and towards fundamentally improving our economy by moving up to an entirely new level.
I agree. Well, that's great. I think we need to do this. We need to work on it right away. We need to end these wars. We need to get people working on this. Is there anything you would like to say in wrapping up our show for this?
I mean, you think about things that the Defense Department is involved in. It's largely been a lot of making trouble. It's hardly been defense. Now, this is something that we could all get together on. You want to defend something, you want to fight a war, go fight a war on deserts in Southwest Asia. Fight a war on asteroids. Those are the real threats.
Right. Now there's a use for video games. Finding asteroids. Can you find the asteroid?
Well, I'm not sure that's how they find them, but
All right, well, it's an idea. or can you blow up the asteroid?
That's right.
I mean, these things, frankly, it's very fascinating because I was reflecting on the the path of a comet, say that's whizzing through our solar system, and it's of course the sun's gravitational pull has something to do with its orbit, right? Uh, but what's going on in our solar system is that the planets are moving there in their orbit. So the question of where the planets are when this thing comes zooming through, there's so many different multi-dimensional factors in this. And I think this is phenomenal for young people. If you had young people working on these problems, imagine the kind of geniuses we would be producing.
Might even be better than those young, intelligent people going to work for a financial firm. Maybe. Talk about the brain drain, finance,
Right.
military waste, NGOs. So,
Yes. Great. Well, thank you so much. And I will just say for our listeners that Memorial Day weekend, May 24th through 26th, in the greater New York metropolitan area, namely in the state of New Jersey, there's going to be a conference of the LaRouche movement for the Saturday and Sunday of Memorial Day weekend. And this kind of scientific breakthrough is going to be one of the topics of the conference because mankind absolutely has to move to a new paradigm. We are moving. We are in a moment of epochal change, but to what? And we should inform ourselves of the direction that mankind has to go and not end up in some kind of disaster like the French Revolution, which I think is a very big danger if you look at some of the economic policies being proposed by some of these characters around the world who are rightly rebelling against the British liberal system, but who don't have a clear sense of mission. So I would like to encourage everybody to put that weekend, May 24th and 25th, on your schedule. Sign up at thelarouche.org to get our email list to get more details. And please tune in regularly, support our work. And thanks for watching tonight. And hopefully we will work on this so that 7 years from now, if that asteroid is going to make impact with Earth, we actually prevent it from doing so.
absolutely.
Thank you, Jason, for joining me.
Thank you.